want to start with September of 1837. And this was a time in church history when the church was established in Kirtland, Ohio, but Joseph Smith, Sidney Rigdon, Vincent Knight, and William Smith took a trip to Missouri to help establish the church out there. This little diagram I'm going to show you now shows the locations that they went. And along the way, they said that they had several meetings in these places, and they were attended with good success and generally allayed the prejudice and feeling of the people, which is kind of cool. By the way, I want to point out that this is a similar route that they took during Zion's Camp in 1834. Many of you may know that when they stopped at the Illinois River there, or that maybe is Upper Mississippi River, on June 4th, Joseph Smith wrote a letter to his wife Emma and described where they had been traveling here. And he said they'd been wandering over the plains of the Nephites, recounting occasionally the history of the Book of Mormon, roving over the mounds of that once beloved people of the Lord, picking up their skulls and their bones as a proof of its divine authenticity. So that was 4 years previously in 1834. But now here in 1837, they were going over those same plains of the Nephites, and they were having these town meetings, and they made this really interesting comment in the report. They couldn't write about it in this issue, but they wanted to close after naming a few questions which are daily and hourly asked by all classes of people whilst we are traveling. How and where did you obtain the Book of Mormon? The answer: Moroni, the person who deposited the plates from whence the Book of Mormon was translated, in the hill in Manchester, Ontario County, New York, being dead and raised again therefrom, appeared unto me and told me where they were, and gave me directions on how to obtain them. I obtained them and the urim and thummim with them, by the means of which I translated the plates, and thus came the Book of Mormon. You can see why so many people are asking about the origin of the Book of Mormon, because this book, Mormonism Unveiled, had become fairly popular among Christian ministers, that they would share it around, and the stories flew that Joseph had not really translated any place, but he'd used a stone and a hat. Now, this book also created another source of controversy, which was the Solomon Spaulding theory. And what they said in this Mormonism Unveiled book was, as I point out here, it was the theory that Solomon Spaulding wrote a novel about the origin of the American Indians, that Sidney Rigdon copied the novel, added a bunch of Christian themes and sermons, and then gave it to Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith read the Spaulding manuscript from behind a screen. The question is, how did Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery respond to these claims? And the answer is, you can read it right in the Joseph Smith papers. The same month that book Mormonism Unveiled was published, Oliver Cowdery wrote the first of 8 letters about church history, partly to clarify the record and to refute the claims of Mormonism Unveiled. The first one talked about the translation. These are the days never to be forgotten, to sit under the sound of a voice dictated by the inspiration of heaven, awaken the utmost gratitude of this bosom. Day after day I continued, uninterrupted, to write from his mouth, as he translated with the urim and thummim, or as the Nephites should have said, interpreters, because that's how we used it in the text of the Book of Mormon, the history or record called the Book of Mormon. And in 1842, Joseph wrote an article for the Times and Seasons called Church History, in which he was providing an outline, again, to correct misunderstandings that were floating around about the origin of the church. And in there, he talked about the origin of the Book of Mormon. He said, with the records was found a curious instrument which the ancients called urim and thummim, which consisted of 2 transparent stones set in the rim of a bow fastened to a breastplate. And then he wrote, through the medium of the urim and thummim, I translated the record by the gift and power of God. The Lord had to have Joseph translate it into Joseph's own language he was familiar with. Naturally, he quoted and blended biblical passages because that's what he was familiar with. But there's a large portion of the Book of Mormon that is not biblical. There's a lot of, in fact, I added up, I think it was around 750 words that are nowhere found in the King James Version. Part of Joseph Smith's vocabulary or mental language bank was the writings of Jonathan Edwards. And Jonathan Edwards lived in the 1700s. Maybe many of you are not familiar with him, but he's a well-known Christian theologian, probably the most influential in America, United States anyway. He wrote a series of very influential books, gave lots of sermons, but in 1808, an 8-volume collection of his books was published. And it turns out it was on sale in the bookstore in Palmyra that Joseph Smith visited every week to get the newspaper for his father. As I've gone through Jonathan Edwards' writings, I found most of the terms and phrases that are non-biblical in the Book of Mormon, but they're found in the works of Jonathan Edwards. He would have studied or read or heard all these sermons from Jonathan Edwards that incorporated this language, not just the terms, but the phrases and even the concepts in some places. One simple example of this is the phrase, in other words. When I do my analysis on this, I look for words and phrases that are non-biblical. I put on here Old Testament 0, New Testament 0, Book of Mormon 13 instances, Doctrine and Covenants 23 instances, 1 in the Pearl of Great Price, and 83 in the works of Jonathan Edwards. The example I give here is from a letter Joseph Smith wrote, which is now D&C 128. Now the nature of this ordinance consists in the power of the priesthood by the revelation of Jesus Christ, wherein it is granted that whatsoever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Or, in other words, taking a different view of the translation, whatsoever you record on earth shall be recorded in heaven, and whatsoever you do not record on earth shall not be recorded in heaven. It says this according to the account of Nephi, or in other words, I, Nephi, wrote this record. In other words, the urim and thummim might have said something like, account of Nephi, let's say, or Nephi account wrote. How would I say that in English? I'm going to say this is according to the account of Nephi, but another view of the translation, to use Joseph's words, would be, I, Nephi, wrote this record. About the establishment of the church and the Latter-day Saints, he didn't start with the first vision like we do today. He started with a brief relation of my experience while in my juvenile years, say from 6 years old, up until the time he received the first visitation. So what happened when he was 6 years old? Why would he start with that? Because he had that leg surgery. He had 3 years to recuperate when he had to be carried or use crutches. And so that's when he was reading. He was doing a lot of reading of Christian material, and we've discussed that. And then because he was unable to work on the farm even, he had plenty of time to read. We know he talked a lot about studying the scriptures even before Moroni came. As I mentioned here, he translated the plates into English using his own mental language bank, his vocabulary, syntax, etc. And we can see the influence of the King James Version with direct quotations and blending. But we can also see it in the influence of Jonathan Edwards. Here's a comparison between the King James Version and Jonathan Edwards. So Mosiah 18:21 says, having their hearts knit together in unity and love. If you go to the Bible, you can find their hearts, and then in Colossians 2:2, being knit together in love. But then you have to go to Psalms to find together in unity, and then you blend those two to get Mosiah 18. In other words, the passages from the Bible, if they were in Joseph's mind, he would come to his recollection or subconsciously, their hearts being knit together in love. And then he also remembers in Psalm, dwelling together in unity. But I feel like Jonathan Edwards, he had a much closer passage than the Bible does. Have their hearts knit together in love, which is closer, in unity and love. He connected those two together. So Joseph could have the love part as a connection. So that's just one example of many. Joseph had studied the characters. Remember, he copied them, he translated them individually. He had the plates for a year before Oliver Cowdery ever arrived. So, and he had already translated 116 pages. So assuming that the same script was from, Mormon used the same script all the way through, and that Nephi used the same script on his own plates. Joseph was so familiar with them, he could just look at the character. He'd already translated those characters and read them off. And when Joseph looks at this, he could probably come up with 4 or 5 or 6 different ways of expressing that. And that's where it required the spiritual input to know which one was the best. Or is there a better way than the one I've thought of? And they worked from morning until night, and that was in the summer in New York, so they were long hours. to do this. It wasn't just reading words that showed up. As soon as you accept that it's a translation, all this, even the anachronisms, all that stuff just goes away because it's a translation by someone living in the 1830s. But if you accept what he said, you understand why he went back in and made changes. You understand why there's non-biblical language from Jonathan Edwards. You understand why there's anachronisms. You understand why there's New Testament language. If he did what he said, what he produced is exactly what we would expect. For those who have questions, just go back to what Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery said, and that's where all the answers are.